Hi everyone, my name is Herberto Dhanis and I'm a PhD student at both Olaf Blanke and Dimitri van de Veel's lab at EPFL Switzerland, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here at OHBM 2022. Today I'm going to show you how we've used neurofeedback to have participants regulate an hallucination network. So to start off, we're going to be talking about an hallucination called the presence hallucination, which is the very strange sensation of having someone behind you when no one's actually there. And of its many characteristics, probably the most important now is that it's related to sensorimotor processing. We also wanted to quickly allude to its clinical relevance. It's present in many neurological diseases, and for example, in Parkinson's, where patients suffer up to 70% of hallucinations. The early onset of hallucinations like the presence hallucination is a predictor for worse functional outcomes. So our lab has actually made significant progress in understanding this hallucination. We have robotic setups to induce this both outside but also inside the MRI. Here are participants doing poking-like movements in the front, and they're replicated in the back, either in synchrony, so in real time, or with a small delay. And it's with this small delay that the presence hallucination is typically induced. My colleagues Bernasconi and Blondiot also showed that the posterior superior temporal sulcus and the inferior frontal gyrus is more active in the condition where PH is induced versus the condition where it's not induced in healthy individuals. And because this was a clinical study, they also related this to neurological patients with PH. Now, because this was already a very large study, we decided to later on do a follow-up analysis to look a bit more into the neuro correlates of induced presence hallucination. And we used co-activation pattern analysis to see which regions are co-fluctuating with these two. And so we did this during task, not during rest. And as you know, with CAPS, you get a series of patterns that are activating over time. Once we had that, we decided to model the temporal properties of these co-activation patterns based on condition, CAP, sensitivity to presence hallucination. We did this for occurrences, average duration, and transition probabilities, by the way. And what we found was that in the asynchronous condition where the presence hallucination is induced, and for participants that are sensitive to it, we see a shift in the transition probabilities of all the co-activation patterns to favor a single co-activation pattern that we're calling now the presence hallucination network. This was not observed if you were not sensitive to PH or in any other condition. So with this established, we had now a new objective that was basically to have real-time regulation of the presence hallucination network. Because if this was possible, it would establish a more causal role between the mechanisms and the hallucination, but also answer the question, well, can you, by regulating the network, modulate the hallucination? And to do this, we turned to real-time fMRI neurofeedback, which is based on the premise that if you give informative feedback on brain activity to a participant, they can then search for a mental strategy to actually regulate that brain activity. So to do this, we had a 5-day experimental paradigm where on the first day, participants would come and we would do PH induction in the MRI, and we would also assess their sensitivity to this induction, followed by 3 days of neurofeedback training, and then another day to assess again if there were any changes in PH induction. We had 20 participants doing this, by the way. Starting with the neurofeedback training, we had in each day 3 runs of neurofeedback followed by a transfer run. The neurofeedback runs were composed by blocks of rest, control, and upregulation. A few important things on that. So in rest, participants were really resting, not doing anything. It was in the control that they would start moving the robot in the non-PH inducing condition, and they would listen to the minimum level of auditory feedback independently of what was going on, and they had instructions to try to clear their mind. When we switched to upregulation, the robot would start in the PH inducing condition, and participants were instructed to have a mental strategy to try to achieve the highest feedback. Now, the feedback here was variable and had an adaptive baseline. What this means is that at all times we were computing a correlational score between ongoing brain activity and the presence hallucination network. But this was always normalized by whatever had happened during the control condition. So the feedback had this adaptive baseline from the previous control block. And then we assessed success of a full neurofeedback run based on a non-parametric procedure that basically looked at the effect size you had achieved between upregulation and control. I'm happy to take questions on that later. You're probably wondering, though, the most important part, what distinguished successful from unsuccessful regulation of the presence hallucination network. And with this, we start on the results. the first thing we had to do to answer that question was to run co-activation pattern analysis again and recover these caps. The most commonly recovered one was actually the presence hallucination cap, which overlapped perfectly with the presence hallucination network. And this was recovered independently. Now, I want to highlight a few other caps we recovered. One of them was the task cap that was more present during both control and upregulation, the anti-task cap, and an anti-DMN cap. Of course, there were a few others. The thing about these two, for example, is that they have overlapping activations with the presence hallucination, especially on the right. And the task cap actually has overlapping deactivations, again, especially on the right, with the activations of the presence hallucination network. And this is going to be very relevant for our results in a second. So, participants had basically two strategies for successful regulation, one upregulation and one downregulation strategy. Before I start, I want to quickly say that you always have the models here on top. And again, we looked at transition probabilities, TP, occurrences, or average durations. So our first upregulation strategy compares obviously successful versus unsuccessful runs. And what we see is that in successful runs, participants learn to shift their transition probabilities from the presence hallucination cap to the two co-activation patterns that have overlapping activations with the presence hallucination network. Why? Because this, we assume this gives you a higher feedback simply because the correlation will be higher. We hypothesize that this also leads to a facilitation of then the occurrence of the presence hallucination network because you are already activating regions of this network. And we seem to have this going back to the presence hallucination, especially from the anti-task co-activation pattern. So this is for our first strategy. Our second strategy actually happens during the control condition, and it's more of a down-regulation strategy. So what we observe is that during control, participants significantly recruit less the presence hallucination cap when they are successful, and they also deactivate it. Why? Because we see that there is a higher recruitment of the task cap that I actually had told you had included a partially deactivated presence hallucination network here on the right. And because the feedback is adaptive, you can see how lowering your presence hallucination network during the control will lead to a higher differential that then gives you a higher feedback in the upregulation condition. Also, a very interesting aspect of this is that this is supported by transition probabilities. So you know that you have this inactive state in co-activation pattern analysis, and that you move out of it to have active caps. And what we see is that successful participants learn that when they move out of this inactive state, they preferentially recruit less the presence hallucination cap and more the task cap, which includes the activations over the presence hallucination network in the control condition. So these are our two strategies that participants found. Now, a very interesting question is, do we have lingering effects after this successful neurofeedback training? And I can already tell you that yes, we do. We had this day 5 and day 1 to assess precisely this. And on day 5, we had a 3-fold increase in presence hallucination sensitivity. How this translated in terms of neurocorrelates, I would say, is even more interesting. Because here we look at differential occurrences between, in this specific case on the presence hallucination cap, between day 5 and day 1. And we see that the more successful you were, the more you activated the presence hallucination cap in the pH-inducing condition, and the less you did it in the non-pH-inducing condition. And these two conditions are comparable to upregulation and to control. Now, the very interesting aspect of this is that it didn't just matter if you were successful or not. If you were, this was actually also regulated by were you sensitive or not to the presence hallucination induction. And only if you became sensitive to this induction do we see this effect. We did not see any effect of success if you didn't become sensitive to pH induction, no matter how successful you were. So this is a very interesting result. And the take-home messages that I want you to have for this presentation are basically that we achieved bidirectional control of the presence hallucination network with an upregulation strategy and a downregulation strategy, and that there were lingering effects that mimicked these two strategies, but only in successful participants that became sensitive to the induction of presence hallucination. So speaking exactly that you can be as successful as you want, but you then have to have a behavioral translation for this to linger after neurofeedback training. And so thank you so much for your attention. I also want to quickly thank my two supervisors, Olaf Blanke and Dimitri van de Wil, and everyone that helped on this paper or on the study we ran before identifying the present hallucination network. And I'm going to try to be as responsive as I can to any questions you have. Please contact me either on Twitter or with my email. I'll try to be as responsive as I can since I'm not physically there. Thank you so much.